Hi guys, this is Forever Motorsport, and today I'll just give my reaction on the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix that's happened started 3 hours ago now and just finished just over an hour ago. So overall, it was quite an interesting race in the midfield, the front of the grid. It was quite touch and go at the start between Alonso and Perez, but towards the early stage of the race, we saw Perez kind of take off into the distance, and then once he broke to about 5 seconds and over 5 seconds ahead of Alonso, it was the pace advantage that he had was just so significant that no one was ever going to overcome that. Alonso did a fantastic job to first of all create a gap to the Mercedes in the early stages of the race, to keep hold of that second place before Verstappen got a bit fortunate with the safety car. However, he probably would have had the pace to close up to Alonso, given that Perez was pulling gaps that were over 10 seconds ahead of Alonso himself. Perez's race pace was overall very strong. You could say he matched Max. Max did get the fastest lap, but Perez was told to hold back a little bit on pace. It was probably just to bring the car home in first, because he was suffering from a brake pedal issue where the brake pedal basically was a little bit more flexible than usual, so there should only be like a slightly narrower range for the input. But he was saying because it was becoming wider and or longer, as the team put it, that meant that when he put his foot on the brake pedal, he felt that there was a lot more lean on the brake pedal, so it felt a lot less sensitive than it usually would. And that definitely it didn't impact his pace too much, to be fair, because he was still matching Max even with that problem. But if Red Bull let the reins off him, then I'm sure he could have kept his fastest lap. But we'll never know that. And Max went for the fastest lap in the last lap of the race, so Perez couldn't respond. And that's a bit of a shame, really, because some mind games going on there that stop Perez from really exploiting his full potential of speed and taking the championship lead, which would have been good to see, and it would have put a tiniest little bit of pressure on Max to keep his game up for the rest of the year. However, you would argue, based on previous seasons, that it's going to be a tall order for Perez to even challenge for the championship, let alone win it. But we'll have to see what happens later in the year. You know, if Verstappen gets any more bad luck and Perez keeps up this level of consistency, maybe Perez challenging for the championship in terms of his race pace, if he can keep it up at that level, might not be so far fetched as we first thought. But in my opinion, I think I'm of the opinion that Perez is uh, fighting a losing battle in the championship, and he'll probably have to settle into second place, but it'll be a comfortable second place. As for best of the rest, I can't really say best of the rest for the other 18 cars, but Fernando Alonso, as of time recording, I saw on a WTF1 post that he had a penalty. It was a 10-second penalty given to him for the rear jack being put up on the car just before the end of the 5 second time penalty was completed, and that resulted in a 10-second additional time penalty at the end of the race, which cost him his podium and put him down to fourth place. Lucky it was 10 seconds. I would say it's lucky it's 10 seconds. It's not any more than that because Lewis Hamilton finished about 5 seconds behind George Russell, and I think the gap was there, so it's a bit touch and go. But Fernando Alonso managed to keep that. Managed to get into fourth place and not lose any more positions, which is quite thankful. He's got 27 points in the Drivers' Championship, and although it's unfortunate he lost his podium, he'll have plenty more opportunities later in the season to get that, and he shows some very strong pace today, which is the main thing. It's definitely strong on the Ferraris, which we'll get onto in a minute. George Russell has been incredible this race. He was right there in touching distance of the Aston Martin Fernando Alonso for the entire race. Fought off Lance Stroll, was fighting Carlos Sainz in the little trio battle between Lance Stroll, Carlos Sainz, and himself, I think. And that was quite interesting to see. Lance Stroll unfortunately had a problem. I can't remember what the problem was. I think it was brakes overheating, I believe. And that was unfortunate for him, but I'm sure he would have got a strong points finish, probably P5 or P6. However, that's not to be. Um, George Russell, very good drive for me, and I think he is really showing what he can do in that Mercedes, despite it not being at the level that they were in previous years. As for Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, let's talk about Lewis Hamilton first, and we'll talk about Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. As for Lewis Hamilton, it was a pretty okay race. He had some decent pace, especially on the medium tyres, but I think he fell away a little bit towards the end from George Russell, and because he was within touching distance, and there was a whole thing of George Russell having to let potentially let Lewis Hamilton through because he had the better pace on the medium tyres. But that wasn't needed because George Russell created a small gap to Lewis, upped his pace, pushed like hell, and managed to maintain the gap. So when the safety car came out, he was in the second safety car came out. He was in a good position to maintain his position and also keeping touching distance of Fernando Alonso, so that when Alonso got the 10-second penalty into the race, he could finally get the podium. But Lewis Hamilton's performance has been quite good. He's got a nice points finish, and I think he will take that, given that he struggled all weekend in qualifying. He was a lot further off his teammate than he was in the race. So with that strategy gamble, along with his quite decent pace, managed to get a solid points finish, which is probably more than he could have hoped for, given that he qualified P7. So that's quite a good performance from him. I'm just trying to think who else was. The Ferraris were next because I think Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. They were both. I mean, in the first part of the race, Carlos Sainz looked very fast, and so did Charles Leclerc. Didn't look too bad on the soft tyres. But then when the safety car came out, they both got put onto hards, and then their pace just fell off a cliff. I don't think that Ferrari car on the high temperatures of Saudi Arabia, along with the hard tyres, it just doesn't work for some reason. And I've seen it in previous races, Ferrari just fall off a cliff on the hard tyre. It's something to do with their car philosophy that just doesn't allow them to get enough temperature into the tyres to allow the tyres to perform at their best. And that's what's kind of costing them a lot of lap time in the races. And that's why they couldn't catch Mercedes today, is because they're just too slow in that second stint. It's such a shame, really, because they showed more pace, I would say, in the early stages of the race and in qualifying this race than they did in Bahrain, so they could have done a better job, but unfortunately it was not to be. But they've got more chances to catch up. They'll develop the car along with Mercedes, and there'll be a fight for second place in the championship between them two teams and Aston Martin, and I'm sure it will ebb and flow between the different races that are coming later on in the season. So then we go down to the lower parts of the top 10. We're talking about Alpine now. So P8 for Esteban Ocon and P9 for Pierre Gasly. P8 for Esteban Ocon, that was a very good performance from him. He's been very consistent this weekend. Qualified P7, P6 or P7, I think, just ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And it was a very good performance from him to get his car into a nice points paying position. Yeah, he did lose out to Hamilton, but Mercedes on race pace probably had the better car. He's been very consistent. He's very good in Saudi Arabia, and to be honest, with the fifth fastest car, you can't really ask for much more. And for Gasly, it was a good recovery after going out in Q. After qualifying P10, he didn't go out in Q2. Sorry, yeah, he made it through to Q3. But he had a very good race. He finished just behind Esteban Ocon, and it was quite consistent in terms of pace between the two of them, I think. Gap wasn't huge, I don't think, towards the end, a few seconds, I think it was, if that. Safety car probably helped, but nevertheless, not too bad a performance. And then Kevin Magnussen, unless I'm mistaken, I think this is Haas's first points of the season, and P10 for Magnussen. Yeah, Yuki Tsunoda got unlucky with a fast-charging Magnussen behind, but I would still say that that's been a very impressive showing from him this weekend, and yeah, it's great to see Haas in the points. I would have thought the first points finish would have come in the first weekend when Hülkenberg qualified P8, but yeah, it's still good to see Haas in the points and being competitive in the lower parts of the midfield and capitalising on other rivals' failures. I mean, if Lance Stroll wasn't the points, finished the race, you would have to argue that Haas wouldn't have been within a chance, and it would have been those top 5 teams of Mercedes, Ferrari, Alpine, Red Bull, and Aston Martin achieving those top 10 positions. Because if everything in terms of reliability happens, I think those top 5 teams will pretty much be the top 10 for a lot of the races this year, because their cars are just that much better in race trim. However, I would say it's a very good drive from Magnussen. He was around about Hülkenberg pace. Hülkenberg did drop back quite a bit as well, and we'll get onto him in a second. But yeah, he's showing a bit better race pace than he did in Bahrain. That's the main thing. So good improvement from him. Good for catching Yuki Tsunoda. I'm pretty sure. I'm not too sure about the order here, but I'm just going to talk about the other drivers because after the top 10, there's no points awarded. So I'm just going to talk about Yuki Tsunoda because I'm pretty sure last time I checked he was P11. And yeah, I think we're seeing a little bit of an improvement different from him because obviously he was racing last year for the same kind of positions. Like he would be racing for like P11, P12 uh, most of the time. But I believe the car he had last year, even though it wasn't that particularly good, it was still a lot better than the car he has this year because the car he has this year is probably one of the worst on the grid. And to get it into P11 is quite a decent drive from him, and he was nearly holding on to the point until Magnussen came onto his rear and overtook him. The only difference I would say between Tsunoda and Magnussen in that situation was Magnussen had less fresh tyres, so the pace of the Haas is clearly quicker, at least around this racetrack, uh, in comparison to the AlphaTauri, and that's also evidenced even further by Nick Fries's performance, which was P13 or P14, but at least it was ahead of the McLarens, which was the main thing. And yeah, the McLarens didn't really have the best day today at all because they came third last and second last. Piastri overtook a car, and I think it was Sargent. It was Sargent and the two McLarens that were battling ahead of Bottas. He finished 30 seconds behind because of an extra pit stop and a few issues, or an issue. And I would say Piastri, it's tough to judge because obviously the overall race was an absolute disaster for McLaren, and Piastri qualified well. So to see him like have that front wing damage at the start of the race and see him drop down to the bottom was a bit of a shame because we never really got to see what he could do. But especially towards the latter parts of the race, I mean, he had the hard tyre on, Norris had the mediums. It's hard to say what the degradation was like on both their tyres relative because I didn't really know too much about it as they were fighting at the rear. I'm sure the more focus would have been put on it if they were further up. But for me, I think Piastri, I guess, this weekend showed some decent pace, and even though it's not quite the finish McLaren wanted, that's promising for the next few races as McLaren hopefully will improve their car. But they need to stop having these disaster shows of races where things go wrong and they make mistakes or reliability problems, whatever, collisions. It needs to stop because if they're ever going to get into the position where they want to be, which is by the end of the season fighting for fourth in the championship, they need to cut out the mistakes and they need to be scoring points when other rivals such as Aston Martin or Red Bull, whoever, are having failures, and they can put themselves in prime position to score those points. Because whilst they've not got the car, they need to be scoring those points so the gap to the top of the midfield doesn't become too big. But at the moment, they're not doing that, and they are kind of failing at failing, if you like, because they've got a failing car and they're not even capitalising. They're not even doing the best they can with the car they've got because they're still making mistakes. So they need to get their act together in that sense before they can look at improving their pace, one thing at a time. And that's the only way they're going to improve is if they first of all stop the mistakes and stop the reliability problems. But yeah, it's a horror show from McLaren this race, to be honest. And then we could talk about Williams because I think Alex Albon, I think he finished. Did he even finish the race? I don't think he finished the race, did he? Well, if he didn't finish the race, I need to check that up. But if he didn't finish the race, that's a huge shame. But in qualifying, Williams didn't really have that much pace. Albon was confused. It didn't feel the same as it did in practice. It felt kind of slidey. Sargent was complaining about the same thing in the race. The car felt kind of slidey and understeery all over the place, and just the handling characteristics of the car were quite poor in comparison to what they both experienced in practice, so they couldn't really do much with it. And that explains why Sargent was racing the McLarens near the back because he didn't have that much pace. So Williams needs to just look into it and see where they went wrong. Obviously, there's a tight midfield, but they were nowhere near. So, yeah, it's a disappointing one for Williams. And I think, other than Alfa Romeo, that's the last one we need to discuss. So, Guan Yu Zhou and Valtteri Bottas. I think Guan Yu Zhou was sort of hovering around 12th, 13th place, whereas Valtteri just fell back. And I'm not really sure why Valtteri fell back, and I'm not really sure why Zhou didn't make that many places up. But Zhou qualified well, so I was surprised to see him go backwards. I thought it would be challenging for the points because the cars ahead of him, or after the issues, I mean, the cars ahead of him were like the Haas and Yuki Tsunoda, so it was surprising not to see him go forwards. But yeah, it's a bit of a shame, to be honest, because I think this could have been a weekend they scored maybe a point or two and didn't really work out. Same in Bahrain with Bottas. I think he had an issue, didn't he? So that didn't work out so well. But anyway, Alfa Romeo need to be another team that needs to get their act together because they should be a team that's fighting for points as well, and they haven't got any. So they need to really sort their issues out, like McLaren and Williams after this weekend, and hopefully the fight for the midfield, which everyone believes is going to be tight, continues to be a tight battle, and we're not just seeing the same 5 teams dominating the points paying positions, because then that's not going to make an interesting fight for anyone. We want to see all 10 teams battling out for the top positions. Not realistic at the moment, but I think a tight midfield is a battle that we could realistically get, and that will make the season quite entertaining. So that's all from me, guys. This has been Forever Motorsport. Leave a like for this video and subscribe if you're new watching this. I hope I could give you some valuable insight into what happened in the Grand Prix. I only just watched it, so it is quite fresh in my mind, but I do things off the top of my head to try and make sure I remember them so I can talk about them in more detail later on. So anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.